Has anyone in this town in your entire life ever been proud to know you? Margaret Holloway's voice rang across Main Street like a verdict. Clara Bennett stood frozen in the dirt, broken bread scattered at her knees, the whole town watching, and not one person moved. Not one person spoke, because in Dust Hollow, Montana, 1884, Clara Bennett was the woman everyone had already decided the answer to. Poor, alone, forgettable. She had believed it herself for so long that the believing had become indistinguishable from the truth. Then a pair of worn boots stopped beside her, and everything changed. Before we begin, if this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Dust Hollow and to the morning that changed everything. Clara Bennett had learned very early in her life that dignity was a luxury she could not afford. Not because she lacked the desire for it. Not because she was somehow lesser than the women who carried it freely in this town. But because dignity, the real kind, the kind that made a woman walk into a room and feel like she had every right to be standing there, required someone to have given it to you first. Required a father who told you that you mattered. A mother who held your face in her hands and said, "You are worth every good thing in this world." A community that looked at you and saw a neighbor instead of an inconvenience. Clara had none of those things anymore. She had a small rented room above the feed store. She had calloused hands and a basket she carried through town 6 mornings a week to collect whatever work she could find. She had the kind of tired that didn't come from one bad night of sleep, but from years of waking up and having to convince herself that today was worth getting up for. That was what Clara Bennett had. And on that particular Tuesday morning in September, even the basket was gone. It lay on its side in the dirt of Main Street, her carefully arranged purchases tumbling across the ground, the half loaf of bread she had saved 3 days to buy, the small wedge of cheese, the 2 potatoes she had been looking forward to as something close to a proper meal. Everything scattered, everything dirty, everything ruined. Because Margaret Holloway had walked into her. Not accidentally. Clara knew the difference. She had spent enough years in this town to recognize deliberate cruelty wearing the mask of clumsiness. Margaret had seen her coming, had chosen not to step aside, had let her shoulder connect with Clara's basket with enough force to send it spinning from her grip, and had then kept walking silk skirts, sweeping the boardwalk without a single pause, a single backward glance, a single breath of acknowledgement. As though Clara were a post she had brushed against. As though the disruption of her entire morning were no more significant than a loose stone in the road. Clara went to her knees because what else was there to do? The bread was still worth salvaging if she could brush it clean. The cheese had landed face down, but the rind was intact. She worked quickly, quietly, the way she had learned to do everything in this town, without making a fuss, without inviting attention, without giving anyone a reason to notice her, more than they already didn't. But then Margaret's voice came back. She had stopped. Turned around, and now she was standing several feet away, with her gloved hands folded neatly at her waist, and her chin lifted at that particular angle she reserved for moments when she wanted an audience to know they were watching. Someone of consequence looked down at someone without any. "Leave it." Clara's hands stilled in the dirt. The street had gone quiet in that particular way it always went quiet when Margaret Holloway decided to make a point. People slowed. People turned. A cluster of women outside the dressmaker's shop tilted their heads with the careful attention of those who are watching something they know will be talked about later. Clara did not look up. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "I'm almost done. I'll be out of the way in just a moment." I said, "Leave it." Margaret's voice was pleasant. That was the part that always struck Clara hardest. How pleasant she managed to sound while she was doing it. Like she was doing Clara a favor by speaking to her at all. Food off the ground is fit for animals, not for table. Unless, of course, your table has changed standards I'm not aware of. There was a soft ripple of laughter from somewhere to the right. Clara felt it go through her like a cold current. She told herself not to react. She had had years of practice. She told herself that in 10 minutes she would be away from this street, away from these eyes, and none of this would be with her, except as another entry in the long ledger of small humiliations she was learning to carry, without letting them show on her face. She stood up slowly, the salvageable items back in the basket, the rest left where they had fallen. "Thank you for your concern," she said, and she meant to leave it at that. But Margaret was not finished. "Tell me something, Clara." Her voice carried the full length of the street now. She was speaking to an audience, not to a person, and everyone within earshot understood it. "Has anyone in this town, in your entire life here, ever been proud to know you?" The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of people who hadn't heard, the silence of people who had heard, and were waiting to see what Clara would do, and had already decided, in the private comfort of their certainty, that the answer was no. Clara stood there with her basket against her hip, and the Montana morning light falling across her face. And she thought, not for the first time, not even for the 100th time, that the cruelest thing about this town was not that people were unkind to her. It was that they had been unkind to her for so long that they had stopped noticing they were doing it. It had simply become the natural order of things. Clara Bennett was poor. Clara Bennett was alone. Clara Bennett was the woman you walked past. She opened her mouth. She didn't have an answer, not one she could say out loud. And in that silence, in that terrible suspended moment where her answer was its own answer, something changed on the street. A pair of boots came to a stop beside her, not beside Margaret. Beside her, worn leather, working boots, the kind that had seen actual ground, actual labor, not the polished shoes of men who came to town to do business, but had never pushed a fence post into frozen Montana earth. Clara looked up. The man standing next to her was tall. Not in a way that announced itself immediately, but in the way you noticed when you were close, the kind of height that came with a certain stillness, as though his body had learned early that it didn't need to perform its own size. He had dark eyes and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and the weathered look of a man who had spent the majority of his adult life outdoors. His hat was in his hand. He was looking at Margaret Holloway. Not at Clara, not at the crowd. At Margaret with an expression that was not anger, not exactly, but something quieter and more dangerous than anger. The expression of a man who had decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it. Margaret blinked just once, but it was enough, Mr. Carter, she said, and from the shift in the street's energy, from the way people stood up a little straighter, from the way the soft chatter to Clara's left went instantly silent, she understood immediately who was standing beside her. William Carter, the largest private landowner in the territory. The man whose cattle operation employed a third of the working men outside of town. The man who had built Carter Ranch from 40 acres and a single barn into something that people spoke of the way they spoke, of geological features, not as something a person had made, but as something that had simply always been and always would be. He was standing beside Clara Bennett in the dirt of Main Street with his hat in his hands. And he was looking at Margaret Holloway. And the street had gone so quiet that Clara could hear the wind moving through the gap between the general store and the post office. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. The voice of a man who had never once in his life felt the need to raise it. "I believe you owe this woman an apology." Margaret's chin went a fraction higher. "I beg your pardon. You walked into her," William said. "You knocked her basket out of her hand. Then you stood here in front of half this town and humiliated her for the mess you caused." He paused. "An apology is appropriate, Mr. Carter, with all due respect." "I'm not asking you to agree with me," he said. "I'm telling you what a decent person would do." The silence had a different quality now. Not the comfortable silence of people watching someone they considered low be put in her place. This was the uncertain silence of Swannell, who had just watched the soul architecture of their morning rearrange itself without their permission. Margaret Holloway straightened her gloves. She smiled the smile of a woman who has lost one small engagement but intends to win the war. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Carter," she said. "I truly do." She turned and walked away. William watched her go. Then and only then did he turn to Clara, and when he looked at her, not through her, not past her, not at the general impression of a woman holding a basket in a dusty street, but at her face, at the particular expression she was wearing that she had not had time to compose into something more acceptable, she felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it. She felt seen. "Are you all right?" he asked. Clara realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly. "I'm fine," she said, the way she always said she was fine, the way that meant the complete opposite of fine, but had long since become the only answer she knew how to give. William looked at her for a moment. "You're not," he said. Not unkindly, not as a challenge. Just as a statement of fact offered gently, the way you might offer a person a hand when you could see they were unsteady. Clara didn't know what to do with that. She tightened her grip on the basket handle and looked down at the remaining breadcrumbs in the dirt and thought that she should say something gracious and walk away. Before this became something she would spend the rest of the week turning over in her mind. "Thank you," she said, "for speaking up." "Shouldn't have needed speaking up," William said. He bent down without ceremony and picked up the last piece of bread she had left behind, the larger piece, the one she had actually wanted, and placed it carefully in her basket. Then he straightened, put his hat back on, and nodded once. "William Carter," he said. "I know who you are," Clara said. Everyone in the territory knew who he was. "I know you know," he said. "I was introducing myself anyway. It seemed polite." And then, incredibly, unreasonably, against every expectation she had cultivated after 26 years of experience with how people in Dust Hollow treated Clara Bennett, the man almost smiled. Not quite, not all the way, but enough that she saw it. She walked away from Main Street with her basket against her hip, and the morning still going, and the bread slightly dusty, and her heart doing something she couldn't name. Something that felt dangerously close to hope, which she had learned a long time ago was the most painful thing a person like her could allow herself to feel. She told herself not to read anything into it. She told herself William Carter was a wealthy man, having a wealthy man's moment of impulse charity, and that tomorrow he would have forgotten she existed entirely, and that she should be grateful for the small act and nothing more. She almost believed it. She was wrong. 3 days later, one of the Carter Ranch hands appeared at the door of the boarding house, where she took in laundry on Thursdays. He had a folded note in his hand, and he delivered it with the careful formality of someone who had been instructed specifically not to lose it. The note was short. The handwriting was plain and direct, unornamented, the writing of a man who did not waste ink on flourish. "Miss Bennett, I have need of an additional hand at the ranch to assist my housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge. The work is honest and the wage is fair. If you are interested, present yourself at the main house, Saturday morning. You are under no obligation, W. Carter." Clara read it 3 times. Then she set it down on the table beside the laundry basket and stared at it for a while. Then she picked it up and read it one more time. The words that stayed with her were not the practical ones about work and wage, though she needed both desperately enough that her hands had gone slightly unsteady the moment she understood what he was offering. The words that stayed with her were the last 4. You are under no obligation. She had been taking work in this town for 6 years. Washing, mending, cleaning, cooking, hauling, lifting, carrying whatever someone needed done, and was willing to pay a poor woman to do for them. And in 6 years, not a single one of those arrangements had ever included the acknowledgement that she had a choice in the matter, that she could say no, that showing up was something she was choosing, not something she was merely desperate enough to agree to. She did not sleep well that Friday night. She lay in her narrow bed above the feed store and looked at the ceiling and thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. She thought about what people would say, what they were probably already saying, given that Mrs. Aldridge had surely told at least one person about the note, and one person in Dust Hollow was enough to populate every conversation in town by the following morning. She thought about the look on Margaret Holloway's face if she heard that Clara Bennett had gone to work at Carter Ranch. She thought about the look on William Carter's face when he'd said, "You are not fine." She was at the main house at 7 o'clock Saturday morning. Mrs. Aldridge was a compact woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense handshake who assessed Clara in approximately 45 seconds, and then said, "You'll do," with the particular efficiency of someone who had seen many people and wasted no time on false preamble. The work was harder than laundering. It was also better. There was more of it, and it had variety, and at the end of a day at Carter Ranch, Clara felt tired in the good way, the way that meant she had done something real, had contributed something, had been useful in ways that weren't just about scrubbing other people's dirt out of other people's clothes. William was rarely in the house. He was a man of the land in the truest sense. He spent his days out in it, fixing what needed fixing, moving what needed moving, making the 10,000 small decisions that kept an operation of that size functioning. Clara saw him at meals, when Mrs. Aldridge set out food for the household, and occasionally, in passing a quick nod across the yard, a word exchanged about something practical. But he was watching, not in the uncomfortable way. Not in the way that made the skin on the back of her neck prickle. The way certain men's attention did when it was weighted with something other than simple observation. He watched the way a person watches when they are genuinely curious about another person, when they are trying to understand something. Clara first noticed it fully on her 4th day at the ranch. She had been repairing a chair in the front room. One of the legs had worked loose from the joint, and Mrs. Aldridge had said to just set it aside, that she'd ask one of the hands to deal with it later. But Clara had the tools and the knowledge, and it seemed wasteful to leave a perfectly good chair sitting useless when the fix would take 20 minutes. So she fixed it. She was just setting it back in place when William came in from outside. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the chair, looked at her. "Mrs. Aldridge said that would wait," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I had time." He looked at the chair again, at the leg she had carefully reseated and secured. "You know how to do that," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "My father was handy," Clara said. "He taught me some things." She straightened up, wiped her hands on her apron. "I hope it's all right that I used the tools from the workbench." "More than all right," William said. He looked at her the way he had in Main Street, direct, unhurried, as though she were someone worth taking the time to actually look at. "Thank you," he said. She was not accustomed to being thanked. Not in that way. Not by someone who meant it without the slight undertone of condescension that wealthy people so often brought to their gratitude with their working help. The slight flavor of "how surprising that you managed this." "You're welcome," she said. He nodded and went back outside. That evening at supper, when the household gathered in the kitchen, William, Mrs. Aldridge, and the 2 hands who slept in the bunkhouse, William told her something that she had not expected. "You don't have to eat in here if you'd rather not," he said. "But you're welcome at the table." Clara had been setting her plate aside to take to the back step, as she had done the 3 previous evenings, as she did everywhere she worked, because it was clearer that way, cleaner for everyone, fewer awkward silences, fewer opportunities for the person who employed her to have to decide how to manage the gap between what she was and what they were. She stood there for a moment, with her plate in her hands. "I don't want to impose," she said. "Then don't," he said. "But you're not imposing. You're eating supper with the people you work alongside. That's not an imposition. That's just a meal." She sat down at the table. It was the best meal she had eaten in years, and it was not because the food was different from what Mrs. Aldridge had served her the nights before. It was because she was sitting down for it. Because someone had told her she had a right to be at the table. The weeks passed. Dust Hollow noticed. Of course it did. Dust Hollow was the kind of town that noticed everything and remembered most of it and used all of it freely. Clara Bennett working at Carter Ranch was the kind of information that traveled fast, first as simple fact, then as speculation, then as something sharper and more pointed as the speculation settled into the particular shape of a narrative that the town found satisfying. Clara was ambitious, some said. Clara was scheming, said others. Clara was doing what women like her always did when they found themselves in proximity to men with land and money. She heard it from Mrs. Aldridge first, not as accusation, but as warning. The old housekeeper set a cup of tea in front of her one morning, and sat across from her and said, "People are talking, dear," with the careful plainness of someone who thinks you deserve to know what's coming, even if there's nothing you can do about it. "I know," Clara said. "Does it bother you?" Clara wrapped her hands around the cup and thought about that question honestly. The way she had started doing more things since coming to Carter Ranch honestly, without the immediate defensive shell she had built up, over years of needing to protect herself from exactly this kind of thing. "Yes," she said. "Good," Mrs. Aldridge said. "It should bother you. It means you still know the difference between what's true and what people are deciding to say." Clara looked at her. "What's the difference worth," she said, "if the whole town believes the other version?" Mrs. Aldridge wrapped her own hands around her cup. She was quiet for a moment. "The difference is worth everything," she said, "to the people who matter." Clara thought about that. She was still thinking about it. 2 days later, when she came across William in the barn, and she made the decision she would later identify as the moment things shifted, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, but quietly and irrevocably, the way the most important shifts in a life almost always happen. She said, "Mr. Carter, I need to say something to you." He was working on a harness. He set it down and gave her his full attention with the simple immediacy that she had come to realize was just how he was. He did not make people wait for his attention or feel that they were competing for it. "People are talking," she said, "about why I'm here, about what I might be planning. And I know that's not your problem. I know you didn't hire me expecting to manage what people say about your household. But I think you should know it's happening, so you can decide." "Clara," she stopped. "I know what people are saying," he said. "I've known since about the 3rd day." She stared at him. "And you didn't?" "It's not their ranch," he said simply. "What they say is their business. Who works here is mine." The anger she had been bracing for the discomfort, the worried calculation she had expected from a man of his position about the cost of association with someone like her, was entirely, completely absent from his face. What was there instead was something she had no name for yet. Something that looked, from where she was standing, like conviction. "I hired you because you work hard and you're honest," he said. "I watched you pick bread off the ground that you were embarrassed to be seen picking up. And then I watched you stand up and face a woman who was trying to take the last of your dignity, and you didn't flinch. That told me more about you than anything people in town could say." Clara had to look away, not because she was ashamed. Because she was not prepared, even now, even after weeks of this, of being seen, of being spoken to like a person, of being thanked and included and asked for her opinion, for the feeling that came with someone saying something true about her. She was not prepared for how much it undid her. "You're a good man," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I'm trying to be," William said. "Some days it's harder than others." She almost asked him what he meant by that. Something in his tone, a shade of something old and tired, made her think he wasn't speaking in generalities. But she had learned to read the silences of the people she worked for, and this one said, "Not yet. Not that conversation. Not today." "Thank you," she said. "For everything. You keep thanking me," he said, "for things you're owed." She left the barn with her heart doing that same unnamed thing it had done the morning on Main Street. That dangerous, impossible, persistent thing that felt like the beginning of something she had spent years convincing herself was not available to women like her. She was wrong about a lot of things that fall. But she was most wrong about that. The talk in town grew louder. By the end of her third week at Carter Ranch, Margaret Holloway had made it her particular project. Not openly, Margaret was too careful for open campaigns. But, in the small, sustained ways of a woman who understood that a reputation could be dismantled, one conversation at a time, she was working on it. At the Wednesday gathering that the Dust Hollow Ladies' Aid Society held in the back room of the church hall, she said things that were never quite accusations. She said, "I'm sure she's a hard worker," in the tone that made hard worker sound like something faintly embarrassing. She said, "I worry about William, all alone out on that ranch, with no family to look out for him," in the tone that cast Clara as something predatory without ever using the word. She said, "Of course we should all wish them well," and managed to make it sound like a eulogy. People listened. People repeated. And Clara, who had no society meetings to attend, no network of careful friendships that would have carried a different version of events, Clara heard about it, the way she heard about most things in this town, late, second-hand, and already solidified into something that had the texture of established fact. She heard it from the woman at the post office who told her not unkindly, but with the particular relish of someone delivering news they know will land. She heard it from the boy who brought feed deliveries to the ranch, who said something to one of the hands that Clara caught only pieces of, but enough pieces to construct the whole. She heard it most clearly, most irrefutably, in the way the women on Main Street looked at her on the Friday afternoon she went into town for supplies. The way they did not look at her, actually, the deliberate not looking, the conversation that continued uninterrupted as she passed, the turning of backs that was so precisely timed it, could only have been intentional. She had been here before. She had been invisible in Dust Hollow her entire life. But this was different from invisibility. This was something active. This was people deciding consciously that she was a person worth removing from view. She walked back to the ranch with the supplies and the sick, hollow feeling in her stomach that she knew from long experience would not pass quickly. She went through the motions of the afternoon dinner preparations with Mrs. Aldridge, the evening chores, and she was quiet in a way that Mrs. Aldridge noticed, and William noticed, and neither of them asked about directly, which was both a mercy and its own kind of pain. That night she lay in the room she had been given at the ranch, a proper room, with a window and a quilt and a small table, and she thought about the note on that first Saturday morning. "You are under no obligation." She thought about the chair leg and the table at supper, and "you keep thanking me for things you're owed." She thought about what it would mean to stay, and she thought about what it had always meant, what it had always cost. To be in Dust Hollow, wanting something that the town had already decided she had no right to have. The question she could not answer, lying there in the dark with the Montana wind coming through the gap at the bottom of the window, was whether she was strong enough this time. Strong enough to hold on to the thing she was, beginning to feel the possibility, the hope, the terrifying, expanding sense that maybe she was not exactly who she had been told. She was in the face of everything this town would do to take it away from her. She did not have an answer, but she was still there in the morning, and she told herself that was enough. For now, she stayed. That was the first decision. And like most of the decisions that actually change a life, it did not feel significant when she made it. It felt like simply getting up and putting her feet on the floor and choosing, one more time, to keep going. But the accumulation of those small choices, each one a quiet refusal to be driven away, was already doing something to her that she did not yet have words for. The second week of October came in cold and fast, the way Montana cold always did, not gradually, not with warning, but as though the season had simply decided overnight to be done with compromise. Clara felt it in the mornings when she rose before dawn to help Mrs. Aldridge with breakfast, the air in the kitchens, sharp and clean before the stove warmed it. She felt it in her hands when she worked outside, and she felt it in some less nameable way, deep in the part of herself that tracked danger and safety and the quality of the spaces she moved through. Carter Ranch felt safe in a way that nothing had felt safe for a very long time. She did not trust it, not entirely. She had learned the hard way that safety was something that could be taken back without notice, and that the warmer and more certain it felt, the more devastating its disappearance. So she held it the way she held most good things, at a slight distance, with her hands open rather than closed, ready for it to be taken. But it was getting harder to hold it that way. Because of William. Not because of anything dramatic. Not because of any single thing she could point to and say that was when it changed, that was the moment. But because of the accumulation of small things that she had begun, despite herself, to notice, to collect, to return to in the quiet moments when she had no work to occupy her hands. The way he told her things, not orders, not instructions, with the flat impersonality of an employer who does not consider the person receiving them. He told her things the way you told things to someone you expected to have opinions. He told her why the north pasture fence needed reinforcing before first snow. He told her the history of the old water system on the property and why he was planning to replace it in the spring. He told her about the cattle operation in the kind of detail that assumed she was capable of understanding it and interested in understanding it, both of which turned out to be correct. She started asking questions. She almost didn't. Asking questions had not been something her life had encouraged. Questions in her experience were often taken as challenges or as evidence of overreach. A poor woman, asking too many questions in the houses where she worked, had a way of becoming a poor woman looking for different employment. But something about the way William answered her, fully, thoughtfully, as though her curiosity were a completely natural and welcome thing, made her keep going. "Why that breed?" she asked, one morning when he was discussing the cattle with one of the hands. The hand glanced at her. William did not. "The cold," he said. "Highland cattle do better in Montana winters. Less feed, stronger constitutions. My father started with Herefords and spent half the profits on getting them through the season." He paused. "Why do you ask?" "I saw how you sorted them yesterday," Clara said. "Some of the younger ones are smaller than the rest of the herd. I was wondering if it was breed or condition." He looked at her then. That direct, steady look. "It's breed," he said. "Good eye." The hand said nothing, but he was looking at her differently. She noticed that too. Within the week, the two hands who slept in the bunkhouse, older men named Cord and Pete, who had been with William for going on 8 years, and who had initially treated her with the particular combination of politeness and wariness they showed toward anyone new in their orbit, began, including her in the casual back and forth of the workday. Not intimately, but in the easy way of people who have decided you are part of the regular landscape of their days. Cord said, "Miss Clara, Pete says the latch on the feed room door needs looking at, thinks it might be your territory," which was a reference to the chair leg, which had apparently become a small piece of ranch mythology. And she had to turn away to hide the thing that happened to her face when she realized it. She fixed the latch. She fixed 2 other things that week that no one had asked her to fix, simply because she saw they needed doing, and she was there, and she had the capacity. Mrs. Aldridge watched this with the focused attention of someone cataloging data. "You can't help it, can you?" the old housekeeper said one evening. "Not as a question." "Help what?" Clara said. "Fixing things, Mrs." Aldridge folded her dish towel with the precision of a woman who found satisfaction in small exactitudes. "You see something broken and you can't walk past it." Clara considered that. "My mother was the same way," she said. "She used to say that leaving something broken, when you had the means to fix it, was a choice to let the world get a little worse on purpose. And she couldn't abide it." Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. "Your mother was a wise woman," she said. "She was," Clara said. And the word was sat between them with all its weight. And Mrs. Aldridge did not press it, which was another form of wisdom Clara recognized and appreciated. The evening came faster now, and the household gathered earlier around the kitchen table. William had taken to staying for the meal rather than eating quickly and retreating to his study, and Clara could not identify exactly when this had become the pattern, or whether it had always been this way, and she had simply been too new to recognize it. But she noticed it. She noticed that he asked her things, sat suffer, not interrogating, not the uncomfortable instinct of a man establishing his authority over someone in his employ, but the asking of a person who has become genuinely curious about another person's mind. "What did you do before the laundry work?" he asked one night, when the wind was going hard against the walls, and the kitchen was warm, and Mrs. Aldridge had stepped out for a moment, and Cord and Pete had taken their coffee to the bunkhouse. Clara wrapped her hands around her own cup. "Whatever there was to do," she said. "After my parents died, I was 19. There wasn't a plan." She paused. "I cooked for the Meredith family for 2 years. Then the house staff for the Alderton estate, the summer they came up from Denver. Mending for the dressmaker on 4th, the laundry." She stopped herself. "It's not a very interesting list." "It's a list of someone who never stopped," William said. "There's nothing uninteresting about that." She looked at him across the table. "Most people see it as evidence of a person who never managed to amount to anything," she said. Not bitterly, just accurately. "Most people," William said, "are very good at deciding what other people's lives mean." He said it with a quiet weight that told her it was not an abstract observation. "Your wife," she said, and immediately felt the trespass of it, the overreach, the familiar panic of having said the thing she should not have said. But William did not close. He did not go behind the wall she had seen him capable of putting up with remarkable efficiency when the conversation moved somewhere he was not ready to follow. He just was quiet for a moment. "She needed more than I knew how to give," he said finally. "Or more than this land could give. I don't know anymore which was which." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She left for Philadelphia 5 years ago. I haven't heard from her since." Clara held very still. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. And then, after a pause, "I was, for a long time, sorry and angry and a lot of things in between. But eventually, you run out of energy for the things you can't change." "What did you do with the energy?" Clara asked, quietly. Genuinely, he almost smiled, "Not quite enough." "Put it into the ranch," he said. And it turned out that was not the worst investment. The silence that settled after that was comfortable, in a way that silences had almost never been in Clara's experience. She had spent her whole life in silences that required management, silences that were full of what couldn't be said, what shouldn't be said, what she didn't have the standing to say. This silence had none of that. It was just two people sitting with the truth of what had been said and finding it sufficient. She did not want to leave the table. She stayed another half hour, and he did not signal in any way that she should go, and when she finally said good night and went to her room, she lay in the dark and did something she had not done in years. She thought about the future, not with dread, not with the careful management of low expectations that had become her habitual approach to any consideration of what came next, but with something tentative and frightened and alive. She told herself to stop. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself she knew exactly how this went for women like her. She did not sleep for a long time. Margaret Holloway came to Carter Ranch on a Thursday morning. Clara was in the garden behind the house when she heard the carriage. She did not immediately place the voice, but she knew from Mrs. Aldridge's tone, when the old woman came to find her careful, warning that whatever was happening at the front of the house required Clara's attention. She went around to the front. Margaret was standing in the doorway, dressed for a social call, hat perfect, gloves on, the picture of a woman paying a friendly visit. She was speaking to William in that particular tone she had, the one that sounded like warmth and was something else, entirely underneath. "I just worry," Margaret was saying as Clara came into sight. "You're an important man in this community, William. And the things people are saying." She paused, her eyes moving to Clara with the precision of a practiced marksman. "Well, I thought you deserved to hear it from a friend rather than from idle gossip." William turned. He looked at Clara, not checking on her, not the look of a man caught doing something he needed to explain. Just registering her arrival, acknowledging her presence. "Mrs. Holloway was just leaving," he said pleasantly. Margaret blinked, just once. "William, I only meant." "I know what you meant," he said, "and I appreciate the neighborly concern. But my household is managed to my satisfaction." He looked at Margaret with a courtesy that contained no warmth whatsoever. "I hope you have a good morning." It was not a dramatic scene. No raised voices, no confrontation that would be repeated in detail at the next Ladies' Aid meeting. Just a door that was firmly, politely, irreversibly closed. Margaret left. Clara stood in the yard and watched the carriage go and felt something complicated move through her. Gratitude, something close to relief, and underneath both of those, a fear she had not yet put into words. The fear that she was beginning to matter here, in this place, to these people, and that mattering was the most dangerous thing in the world for someone with as little protection as she had. "Are you all right?" William asked. She turned to find him still in the doorway. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her. "You're not," he said, the same as before, in the same tone, with the same gentle inflexibility. "She's going to keep coming," Clara said. "People like her don't stop." "I know," he said, "and eventually it costs you something." "Things worth having usually do," William said. She stared at him. He met her eyes, without flinching, without qualification, without the slight retreat she had been bracing for. And in that moment, standing in the cold October morning, with the carriage dust still settling in the lane, Clara understood something that terrified her completely. She was falling in love with him. Not the comfortable, theoretical, safely distant kind of feeling she had permitted herself occasionally over the years, the kind you could put away at the end of the day like a tool you had no use for. The real kind, the kind that rearranged things inside you without your permission. The kind that made you suddenly aware of how much you had to lose. She said nothing. She went back to the garden. She pulled weeds with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary. And she did not look at the house for a long time. That evening, after supper, William asked her to walk with him to the north fence. He needed to check the repairs they had done to the post, closest to the creek, he said, and it was better done before dark. She went, because she could not think of a reasonable reason to say no that would not reveal more than she was prepared to reveal. They walked without speaking for a while. The quiet between them was different than it had been in the kitchen. It had an edge to it, not uncomfortable, not hostile, but charged, the way the air charged before a storm when the whole world seems to hold its breath. William stopped at the fence. He checked the post. He checked the wire. He stood looking at the darkening land for a moment, and then he said, without looking at her, "I know what you think." She said, "You don't. You think this ends badly," he said. "You think I'm a decent man having a decent moment, and that eventually the decent moment passes and you're left where you started." She was very still. "Isn't that a reasonable to think?" she said. "It would be," he said, "if it were accurate." He turned to look at her. "I haven't said anything," he said, "'cause I don't think you're ready to hear it. And maybe I'm not ready to say it, but I need you to know, Clara." He said her name the way people said things they had been thinking for a long time. "I need you to know that you did not imagine the last month. None of it." Her throat was tight. "William, I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I'm not making a declaration. I want you to know. Because you spend every day convincing yourself that you're wrong about the things you feel. And I've watched you do it, and I can't watch it anymore without saying something." The wind moved through the grass. Clara looked at him. This man, this careful, quiet, difficult man who had spent 5 years building a wall around himself, and was standing here in the cold of an October evening, telling her she had not imagined what was between them and every wise and self-protective instinct she had spent 26 years developing, was screaming at her to be careful, to be smart, to remember who she was and what happened to women like her when they let themselves believe in things. "I'm frightened," she said, and it was possibly the most honest thing she had ever said to another person in her life. "I know," he said. "You don't know why. Tell me." She looked at the land, at the fence line, at the last of the light going out of the sky. "Because every time I've started to feel like I belonged somewhere," she said, "something came along and reminded me that I didn't. And I've gotten back up every single time. But I don't know how many times I have left." Her voice was steady. She had not cried. She was not going to cry. "I can't survive caring about something and then losing it. Not again. Not this." The silence that followed was long enough that she was certain she had said too much. That she had miscalculated the distance between where they were and where she had just put herself by saying that. Then William said very quietly, "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. "That's not a promise I can ask you to make," she said. "You didn't ask," he said. "I offered." He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She had known this about him for weeks. She had watched him with his hands, with his land, with the people who worked for him, the way he kept his word in small things and large things, with the same undemonstrative consistency. He was not a man who made easy promises, which meant this was not an easy promise, which meant it was something else. She did not move toward him. He did not move toward her. There was still too much between them, too much history, too much caution, too much ground that needed to be crossed more slowly than this moment wanted it to be crossed. But something shifted, finally, irrevocably, the way the most important things shift. She believed him, not completely, not without reservation. But enough, and enough she was learning, was a place to begin. The week that followed was both the best and the most difficult of her time at Carter Ranch. For the simple reason that everything felt different now, and different was its own particular kind of terrifying when you had spent years relying on the sameness of low expectations. She caught herself laughing at something Cord said at breakfast and felt guilty for it, as though joy were something she had borrowed from someone else's supply and would need to return. She caught herself looking forward to supper, in a way that had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with who would be sitting at the table, and she recognized the looking forward as dangerous and could not make herself stop it. She started talking more, not the careful, measured, self-monitoring speech of a woman managing her own impact on a room, but actual talking. She told Mrs. Aldridge about her mother's recipe for apple preserves and argued with her, gently but sincerely, about the correct proportion of cinnamon. She told Cord what she genuinely thought about his plan for repairing the south gate, and he looked slightly startled, and then grudgingly admitted she had a point. She told William, one afternoon when he brought something to her to look at, and asked what she thought, exactly what she thought, without the layer of hedging and qualification she normally built around her opinions. He listened, he considered, he said, "You're right. We'll do it your way." She walked away from that conversation, with her heart going so loud in her chest she was certain it was audible. Then the letter came. It arrived on a Friday, delivered with the week's mail, addressed to William in a hand Clara did not recognize. She didn't see it arrive. She didn't think about it. It was simply part of the afternoon, the ordinary passing of an ordinary day, until she came into the kitchen to find Mrs. Aldridge standing very still with a dish towel in her hands, and William at the table with an open envelope in front of him, and an expression on his face she had never seen before. Something cold moved through her. She stopped in the doorway. "What happened?" she said. William looked up. He looked at her for a moment in a way that reminded her of the very first time in Main Street, beside the bread, when he had looked at her like she was a person who mattered. "My wife," he said. "My former wife." He stopped, started again. "She's coming back." The floor seemed to shift slightly beneath Clara's feet. "Back to Dust Hollow," she said. "Back to the territory," he said. She says he looked at the letter. She says she made a mistake. She says she wants to talk. Clara said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be too much or too little, or exactly the wrong thing. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen of a ranch she had worked her way into over the course of 6 careful, fragile, increasingly precious weeks, and she felt the familiar sensation of the ground being pulled out from under her feet. She had known, some part of her had always known. This was how it went for women like her. Just when the thing you were afraid to want became the thing you were already holding, the world found a way to take it back. She turned around and walked back out of the kitchen before she said anything she couldn't take back. She went to the garden, where there was nothing to do at this hour, but she needed her hands to be occupied, and she knelt in the cold dirt, and she pressed her palms flat against the earth, and she breathed. She did not cry, she did not run, she breathed, and then she thought slowly, carefully, with the particular clarity that comes sometimes in the middle of shock, when everything superfluous has been stripped away, and you are left with only the thing that is most true. She thought about what William had said at the fence. "I'm not going anywhere." She thought about the way he had said it. She thought about the expression on his face when she had walked into the kitchen just now. Not relief, not guilt, not the expression of a man rescued from something he had been looking for an exit from. The expression of a man standing at the edge of something complicated, looking to her, as the person he most needed to know one was still there. She pressed her palms harder against the dirt. She was still there. The question was whether she could hold that, whether she was strong enough, this time, to stay in the face of not knowing. Whether Clara Bennett, who had survived everything this town had thrown at her, who had gotten up every time she was knocked down, who had fixed what was broken and stayed when she should have gone, and learned against every warning of her better judgment to want something she wasn't sure she deserved, whether she was finally, at the age of 26, enough. She stayed in the garden until the cold drove her in. And when she came back inside, William was still at the table, and he looked at her, with that expression she still had no name for, and he said, "I need you to know something." "Not tonight," she said quietly. "Tomorrow, tell me tomorrow." He studied her face. Then he nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. She went to her room. She lay in the dark. She did not know what the morning would bring. But she was still there, and she was beginning slowly, painfully, with everything in her braced against it, to understand that staying was itself a form of strength, that choosing not to disappear, even when disappearing would have been easier, even when everything in your history told you that you would end up hurt if you didn't, that choosing to remain, to take up space, to insist on your own presence in a situation that had not yet revealed which way it would fall. That was not weakness, that was possibly the bravest thing she had ever done. Morning came the way it always did, indifferent to what the night had cost her. Clara was already in the kitchen when William came downstairs. She had the stove going and the coffee on, and her hands busy with the bread dough, because busy hands were the only thing standing between her and the conversation she had asked him to wait on. The conversation she had lain awake half the night preparing herself for, and still did not feel ready to have. He came in and stopped. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her the night before, that particular careful attention, that quality of looking that she had spent weeks learning to receive without flinching. "Clara," he said. "Coffee's ready," she said. He crossed the kitchen and poured himself a cup and stood for a moment with his back to her, and she could feel him deciding something, the way you could sometimes feel a person making a decision even without seeing their face. Then he turned around. "Her name is Diane," he said. "She left in January of 1879. She took what she came with, and she didn't look back, and I spent the better part of 2 years thinking I had done something wrong that I couldn't name." He set his cup down. "Then I spent another 2 years, understanding that the wrong thing was never mine to fix." Clara kept her hands in the dough. It gave her something to do with the tension in her body. "And now she's coming back," Clara said. "She says she wants to talk," William said. "That's all the letter said. What do you want to do?" He looked at her steadily. "I want to know what you're thinking," he said. She almost laughed. Not bitterly, genuinely, at the directness of it, at the way he kept doing that, kept making her the point he was orienting toward, when every protocol of his position in this world said she should be the one asking him what he needed. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that you have history with this woman. And history is complicated, and it's not my place to—" "Clara," she stopped. "Don't do that," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Don't reduce yourself to a role," he said. "Don't tell me what your place is. I'm asking what you think. I'm asking because it matters to me." The bread dough sat forgotten under her hands. "I think," she said slowly, "that you should hear what she has to say. Because you're a fair man, and fair men don't close doors before they know what's on the other side." She paused. "And I think that whatever happens after that, I need to be able to live with the way I behaved in the meantime." He studied her face for a long moment. "You're not going to make this easy on yourself, are you?" he said. "I never have," she said. Something moved across his face that she could not fully read. Then he picked up his coffee and said, "Diane arrives in Dust Hollow next Thursday," and walked out of the kitchen. And Clara pressed her hands back into the bread dough and breathed through the next few minutes the same way she had breathed through every hard thing in her life, one breath at a time, without looking too far ahead. The news of Diane Carter's return reached the town before the woman herself did. This surprised no one, least of all Clara. Dust Hollow's information network operated with a speed and efficiency that no telegraph system could match. And by Monday morning, 3 days after the letter, the essential facts had already completed their first full circuit of the town's social architecture, and were on their second, acquiring new layers of interpretation with each pass. Diane Carter was coming back because she had run out of money, said some. Diane Carter was coming back because she had never stopped loving William, said others, with the particular satisfaction of people who find romantic narrative more appealing than practical explanation. Diane Carter was coming back because she had heard about the woman William Carter had installed in his household, and she was coming to put a stop to it, said Margaret Holloway, to anyone who would listen, in the tone of a woman delivering a verdict she considered long overdue. Clara heard all of it. She heard it from Mrs. Aldridge, who reported with the precision of a military intelligence officer. She heard it in the feed store when 2 women near the back spoke just loudly enough for her to catch every word, while pretending not to know she was there. She heard it in the particular quality of silence that greeted her on Main Street on Tuesday. The silence that had a shape to it, the shape of people who have decided something about you and are simply waiting for events to confirm it. She heard it, and she kept going because that was what she did. But something had changed. She noticed it first in the way she responded to Mrs. Aldridge's report on Monday morning. In the past, the Clara of 6 months ago, the Clara who had knelt in the dirt of Main Street and answered Margaret Holloway's cruelty with "I'm sorry," that Clara would have received the information as confirmation of what she already suspected about her place in this story. She would have nodded and said, "I see," and begun the quiet, internal process of lowering her expectations back to a safe level. Instead, she said, "What do you think she wants, Mrs.?" Aldridge raised an eyebrow. It was the eyebrow of a woman who had spent decades watching human behavior and found it consistently interesting. "I think," the old housekeeper said, "that she wants what people always want when they come back to a thing they threw away. She wants to find out if she still could have it, if she chose." "And if she could," Clara said. "That," Mrs. Aldridge said, "depends considerably on William." Clara thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she was working, and she noticed with the slight detachment of someone observing their own behavior from a short distance that she was not spiraling. She was not collapsing into the old familiar narrative of her own inadequacy. She was thinking, clearly and somewhat coldly, about a situation with real stakes, and she was doing it from the position of a person who had some standing in the matter. That was new. She was still deciding what to do with it when William found her that afternoon. He had been in town for the better part of the day accounts. He had said at breakfast, which was true enough, but also the kind of truth that contains other truths inside it. He came back with a look on his face that told her the day had been more complicated than accounts. She came early, he said. Clara set down what she was holding. Diane is in Dust Hollow, he said. She arrived this morning. I ran into her outside the bank. How was that? Clara said. Carefully. He looked at her with the expression of a man choosing his words with unusual precision. Strange, he said. Like meeting someone you used to know and realizing that the person you knew and the person standing in front of you share a face and almost nothing else. What did she say? She wants to come to the ranch, he said. She says she has things to explain. Things she should have said before she left. He paused. I told her I needed to talk to my household first. Clara heard that my household and understood that it was not an accident of phrasing. You don't need my permission, she said. No, he said. But I need your honesty. If this is something that asks too much of you, Clara, I need to know. She looked at him. Invite her, she said. Hear what she has to say. That's the right thing. I'm not asking about the right thing, he said quietly. I'm asking about you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm all right. And this time, for possibly the first time in her life, when she said those words, she was not entirely lying. Diane Carter arrived at the ranch on Wednesday. She was beautiful. Clara had expected this. In the abstract way, you expect things about a person who has left an impression large enough to reshape another person's life. But the abstract expectation did not fully prepare her for the specific reality. Diane Carter was tall and fair, with the kind of poise that came from having spent a life in rooms that believed her presence enhanced them. She wore traveling clothes that had clearly not come from anywhere in the territory. She moved through the house with the ease of a woman who had lived in it before and had not entirely forgotten her fluency with its spaces. She looked at Clara once quickly, a single sharp assessment, and then looked away. It was the kind of look that catalogued and dismissed in the same motion. The look of someone who has decided, before gathering any evidence, what category you belong in. Clara had received that look from women in this town her entire life. It hurt less now than it would have 2 months ago. She was not sure if that was strength or simply scar tissue. William brought Diane into the front room. Mrs. Aldridge excused herself with the efficiency of a woman who had survived several decades of human drama by knowing exactly when not to be in a room. Clara stayed in the kitchen, within hearing distance but not obtrusively present, and she told herself this was appropriate and not the small, frightened retreat it might also have been. She could hear the voices through the wall. Not the words, just the rhythm of them. Diane's voice had a particular music to it, practiced and modulated in the way of someone who had learned to deploy it strategically. William's voice was the same as it always was, low, steady, giving nothing away. After 20 minutes, the voices stopped. Then William said something Clara could not hear, and Diane said something back, and then there was silence, and then the sound of the front door. Clara stayed where she was. William came into the kitchen. He looked tired, not the tired of someone who had been worn down by emotion, but the tired of someone who had done a necessary thing and was on the other side of it. She wants money, he said. Clara looked at him. She married badly in Philadelphia, he said. The man she left for it didn't hold. She came back because she's in debt and she thought. He stopped. She thought things here might be different than they are. Are you going to help her? Clara said. I'm going to pay what she's owed from the dissolution of the marriage, he said. Her share of what was joint property when she left. That's fair. He said the word fair with the heaviness of a man who has had to think carefully about what it means. But she's not coming back here, Clara. That's not what this is. Clara absorbed that. How do you feel, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Like something I've been carrying for 5 years. Just got a little lighter, he said. She nodded. She turned back to what she had been doing. And then William said, Clara, look at me. She turned. I meant what I said at the fence, he said. None of that changed. She held his gaze. "I know," she said, and she did. For the first time, completely and without reservation, she believed him. Not because she had stopped being afraid. Not because the ground had stopped feeling uncertain beneath her feet. But because she had watched him navigate a genuinely hard thing with the same quiet integrity he brought to everything else. And there was no longer any reasonable argument against what she could see with her own eyes. He was exactly who he appeared to be. She had simply spent so long in the company of people who were not. The days that followed Diane's visit had a quality that Clara could only describe, privately, as settling. Like the way a house sounds after a storm has passed, and the wind has stopped, and the structure has been tested and held, and the silence that comes after is different from the silence before, deeper, more certain, earned. William was different in small, important ways. He laughed more easily. He spent less time in his study in the evenings, and more time at the table, in conversation, in the easy company of the household. He stopped wearing, around his eyes, the particular tightness of a man who is managing something he can't fully put down. And Clara was changing in ways that frightened her and exhilarated her in approximately equal measure. She had opinions, and she was stating them. She had ideas about the ranch's operations, small things, practical things, born of observation, and the particular analytical quality of mind she had developed over years of different households and learning how different systems operated, and she was sharing them. And they were being listened to, and some of them were being acted on. She told Cord one morning that she thought the feed storage arrangement in the East Barn was creating unnecessary labor, and she had an idea for how to reorganize it. He looked at her with the expression he had, long since stopped bothering to hide the expression, that said, "Why is a woman talking to me about feed storage?" And then she explained her reasoning, and his expression shifted incrementally toward something that reluctantly admitted she had a point. And by the afternoon, the reorganization was underway. She told William one evening that she had noticed a pattern in the water usage on the north end of the property that suggested they were losing more than they realized to seepage. He looked at her with full attention, asked her to walk him through what she had observed, spent the next 2 hours with her going over the specifics. By the following week, he had 2 men working on the problem. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. The evening after they had confirmed the seepage was worse than initially thought, and the fix would save the operation a significant amount before winter. "Worked for a family in Billings," Clara said. "The husband ran cattle. He used to talk through problems at dinner. I think he forgot I was there a lot of the time." She paused. "People forget I'm there quite often." "I know," William said. "That's their loss." She looked at him. "You've been listening to me," she said. "Since the beginning." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He thought about that for a moment. In the way he thought about things, he wanted to answer accurately rather than quickly. "Because you say things worth listening to," he said. "And not all at once. Because you've spent your whole life being taught that you don't, and I wanted you to have a different experience." She was quiet. "That's a very deliberate thing to do for someone," she said. "You're a very worth the effort person," he said simply. She looked away, not because she didn't want to receive it. Because it was too large to take in all at once, the fullness of being seen, that clearly, that steadily, by another person. She needed to look away, the same way you needed to look away from something bright. It was in this particular season of careful, growing things that the ranch received the news that would change everything. It came not as a letter this time, but as 3 men on horseback, arriving at Carter Ranch on a Tuesday morning, with the collective authority of people who have been sent rather than come of their own accord. 2 of them were lawyers from the territorial capital. The third was a man named Aldous Whitfield, who represented a consortium of investors who had, over the previous 18 months, been quietly acquiring land interests in the region, with an eye toward a rail development they believed was coming through the territory within the decade. Clara was not in the room for the initial meeting. She was in the East Barn when the riders came, and it was Mrs. Aldridge, who came to find her 40 minutes later with the particular compact tension of a woman carrying news she does not like. "They want the ranch," Mrs. Aldridge said. Clara went still. "They don't want to take it," the old woman clarified. "They want to buy it. Or," she paused, "they want to pressure it. There's a water rights dispute in the filings, something that was never properly settled when the original land was deeded. They say they've acquired the surrounding filing that makes Carter Ranch's water access contingent on an agreement that expired." Clara understood property disputes the way she's understood most things, from observation, from years of proximity to the problems of other people's lives. And she understood immediately that what Mrs. Aldridge was describing was not a simple legal matter. "They're using the filing as leverage," Clara said. "Yes," Mrs. Aldridge said. "If the ranch can't prove settled water rights, the whole operation becomes uncertain. The cattle need the water, the hands need the water. Everything." She stopped. "Mr. Carter is in there with them right now. They've given him 2 weeks to respond." Clara was already moving. She did not go to the meeting room. She went to William's study, where she knew he kept his property documents. The original filings, the deeds, the records she had seen him reference when she had asked him about the water system, and he had shown her the property survey. She had looked at those documents with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand the system, and she had noticed things, and at the time she had not known those things would matter. She pulled the survey and the original deed and the water rights filing from the drawer where she had watched him put them, and she sat down at the desk, and she read. She read with the speed of someone who has learned that in emergencies you cannot afford to be slow, and she read with the precision of someone who has spent years learning to understand documents that were written to be misunderstood by anyone without the education or the access to read them properly. And she found it. 30 minutes later, she walked into the meeting room. She was aware of the way the room received her entry. The two lawyers exchanged a look. Whitfield glanced at her with the practiced dismissal of a man who deals in large sums and has no patience for interruptions. William looked at her with the expression he always wore when she came into a room, the expression of a man who is glad to see a specific person. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. She was not sorry. "Mr. Carter, there's something in the original filing you should see." Whitfield said, "This is a private." "The water rights were never contingent on a neighboring agreement," Clara said, setting the documents on the table in front of William. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands steady. "The 1871 filing contains a prior appropriation claim that predates the agreement they're referencing by 3 years. Prior appropriation doctrine would make the surrounding filing irrelevant to Carter Ranch's access." She looked at the lawyers. "I imagine you know that." There was a silence in the room. One of the lawyers looked at the document she had laid on the table. Something moved across his face that was not entirely comfortable. "Where did you?" Whitfield started. "These are the original property records," Clara said, "which have been in this study since before anyone at your consortium started acquiring neighboring filings." She looked at William. "You should have your own lawyer review this." "But I don't think they have what they're claiming to have." The silence stretched. William looked at the document. Then he looked at the lawyers. Then he looked at Whitfield with an expression that had left the range of uncertainty and arrived somewhere considerably more settled. "I think," William said, "we're done for today." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "Mr. Carter, I want to be clear that this consortium's interest in this property is not." "I heard you the first time," William said. "My lawyer will be in touch." The three men left. The room was very quiet. William looked at the document she had found, and then he looked at her, and for a moment he said nothing, and the nothing had a density to it, a particular fullness, that Clara felt in her chest. "How did you know?" he said. "I read the survey," she said, "when you showed it to me about the water system. I remembered the dates." "You remembered. I pay attention," she said simply. He stood up from the table. He crossed the room and he stood in front of her, not too close, not with any pressure, but present in the way he was always present, fully, unambiguously, like a man who had decided where he was standing and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "Clara," he said. "It wasn't," she started. "It was just reading a document." "It was not just reading a document," he said. "You walked into a room full of men who were trying to take something from me, and you put the thing they were using against me on the table in front of them, and named what it was." He paused. "Do you know how many people who've worked this land for years couldn't have done that?" She felt heat rise in her face. "I just stopped telling me it was nothing," he said gently but without give. "Stop doing that." She closed her mouth. He was right. She had been about to diminish it. Automatically, reflexively, with the long-practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned that making herself small was the safest response to being seen doing something well. She had been about to explain it away before anyone else could. She stopped. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The word lawyer traveled through Dust Hollow at the same speed everything else did. And by the following morning the story had already acquired dimensions it had not had in the meeting room. By the second morning it had a heroine, though the town was not entirely sure what to do with the identity of that heroine, which complicated the narrative considerably. Margaret Holloway heard about it and said nothing publicly, which was, in its own way, more telling than anything she had said. The woman at the post office told Clara, when she came in for the week's mail, "I heard what you did for Mr. Carter," just that flatly, without elaboration. "I read a document," Clara said. The woman looked at her for a moment. "Well," she said, "I suppose someone needed to." It was not an apology. It was not even, exactly, an acknowledgement of anything that had been done wrong. But it was something. A small shift in a long-established structure. A crack in a wall. Clara took the mail and walked back to the ranch with her shoulders back and her head up and the Montana morning coming down, cold and clear around her. And she thought, for the first time in her adult life, that she was not afraid. Not entirely, not right now. She was still frightened of the future, in the way you are frightened of anything that matters. She was still frightened of the size of what she was beginning to feel for William, and of what it would cost if it went wrong, and of the long list of things she did not know and could not control. But she was not afraid of herself. She was not afraid of the space she took up. And that particular, small, enormous thing was something she had never been able to say before. She was almost to the ranch lane when she heard the horse coming up fast behind her. She turned. It was Cord, riding hard, his face carrying the expression she had learned to read over the past months as the expression of a man with genuinely bad news. "Miss Clara," he said, pulling up, "you need to come back." "What happened?" "Whitfield," Cord said. "He went to the bank. There's a lien, something about a secondary claim, against the property that the lawyer says might hold even with the water rights settled." He stopped. "And there's something else." Clara felt the cold move through her. "What?" she said. Cord looked at her with the expression of a man who did not want to be the one saying this. "They went to see Margaret Holloway," he said, "and she told them some things about you. About where you came from, about the family. Things she said." Woody stopped. "William needs you back at the ranch, Miss Clara." Right now, she was already moving. She walked fast. Then faster, and the fear was back now. Not the fear of herself, but the old fear, the familiar fear, the one she had lived with her whole life, the fear of being defined by something she had no control over, of having the facts of her birth and her poverty and her history weaponized against her by people who had never needed a single fact when a story would do just as well. She walked toward the ranch, with her heart going hard in her chest and her hands in fists at her sides, and the one thought, the single clear and steady thought that she held on to, as everything else lurched and tilted around her. She was not going to run, not this time. Whatever was waiting for her back at that house, whatever Margaret had said, whatever Whitfield had filed, whatever the town had decided about Clara Bennett's right to exist in the margins of a good man's life. She was going to face it. She had come too far. She had survived too much. And she was done being the woman who disappeared when things got hard. She heard the voices before she reached the front door. Not shouting, William did not shout. But the voices had the particular compressed quality of people saying serious things in serious tones, and Clara recognized at least three of them. William, and a man she believed was the lawyer he had called in from the territorial capital, and a third voice she did not recognize, but whose cadence carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome information as though it were simply weather. She pushed the door open and walked in. The three men were in the front room. William turned the moment she entered. He always turned when she entered a room. She had noticed this about him weeks ago, and had told herself it meant nothing, and had been wrong, and the expression on his face was controlled, in a way that told her the situation was worse than Cord had described. "Clara," he said. "Tell me," she said. The lawyer, a compact man named Hargrove, who wore his seriousness like a second coat, looked at her with the assessing expression of someone trying to determine how much a person could handle. "The water rights are settled," he said. "You were right about the prior appropriation. That's not the problem. Then what is?" she said. Hargrove glanced at William. William gave a short nod. "Whitfield's consortium has filed a secondary claim," Hargrove said. "Not on the water. On a parcel in the southeast corner of the property, approximately 40 acres that were part of the original territory grant. They're arguing the original deed contains an error in the boundary survey. If the claim holds, it severs the access road to the eastern pasture. Without that access, the cattle operation loses roughly a third of its grazing land." He paused. "And that's survivable, potentially, except that they've also called in a note." Clara looked at William. "What note?" she said. William was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago I borrowed against the property to finance the expansion," he said. "The note was held by a local bank. Whitfield's people bought the note last month. They're calling it due in 30 days. The full shape of it assembled itself in Clara's mind with the cold clarity of a thing that had been built deliberately and was now standing fully formed in front of her. "They don't want the parcel," she said. "No," Hargrove said. "They want the whole ranch," she said. "The parcel claim is pressure. The note is the actual mechanism. If they can make the operation look unstable, if they can create enough uncertainty about the property's viability, they force a sale at their price." Hargrove looked at her with an expression that revised itself upward. "That's correct," he said. "Can we fight the note?" she said. "We can argue the terms," he said, "but 30 days is 30 days. If we can't restructure or how much," she said. The number Hargrove said was large. Not unsurvivable for a man of William's resources, but large enough that meeting it in 30 days would require liquidating things that would weaken the operation significantly. It was the kind of number that had been chosen, with care, large enough to hurt, specific enough to be achievable, so that Whitfield's consortium could tell themselves they had offered a fair alternative to just taking what they wanted. Clara stood in the room and thought. She thought about the documents in William's study. She thought about the survey she had read. She thought about the months of watching the ranch's operation, of listening to William talk through its economics at supper, of the questions she had asked, and the answers she had received, and the picture she had assembled, piece by piece, in the way she assembled most pictures patiently, thoroughly, from the details other people overlooked. She thought about a conversation she had had with Mrs. Aldridge in early October, when the old housekeeper had mentioned, almost in passing, that the ranch's timber rights in the northern section had never been sold or leased, and that several operations in the region had been paying well for access to timber for the railroad work coming through the territory. She said, "Mr. Hargrove, the timber rights on the northern 40, what's their current assessed value?" Hargrove blinked. "I'd have to look at the filing." "They've never been leased," Clara said. "They're held free and clear." and there are 3 rail construction operations within 60 miles that have been paying above market rates for timber access for the past 18 months. She looked at William. If you leased the timber rights, not sold, leased, so the land stays yours at current market rates, what does that do to the 30-day number? The room was quiet. William looked at Hargrove. Hargrove was already doing the calculation, something shifting in his expression. It doesn't cover it entirely, he said slowly, but it covers enough that the remainder could be restructured at the bank without liquidating. He stopped. Where did you? Mrs. Aldridge mentioned the timber rights in October, Clara said. I remembered it. She looked at William. It's your decision. But I think it holds. William looked at her for a long moment. Not with surprise. She was past the point of surprising him, she thought. He had stopped being surprised by her, somewhere around the 3rd week, when she had repaired the chair, and he had stopped looking at her like she was an unexpected phenomenon and started looking at her like she was simply herself. Like who she was had settled into his understanding and become a permanent feature of the landscape. What was on his face now was something else. Something she still did not entirely have the courage to name. Get the filing, William said to Hargrove, and get me the names of the rail operations. I can get those, Clara said. Both men looked at her. I know one of the contractors, she said, from work I did 3 winters ago. He'll talk to me. She paused. Yes, William said. Please. She went. She spent the next 4 hours doing the work, and it was work in the purest sense of the word, not the performed labor of someone trying to prove a point, but the genuine, focused effort of someone who understands what is at stake and is applying every resource she possesses to address it. She wrote 2 letters, sent Cord with both, and spent the intervening time with Hargrove going over the property records with the same meticulous attention she had brought to the water rights filing. Hargrove, she noted, stopped treating her like an interruption somewhere around the 2nd hour. By the time Cord returned with a response from the first contractor positive, interested, available to discuss terms, within the week, Hargrove had assembled enough of the picture to say, with the careful optimism of a man who did not commit to optimism lightly, that he believed they had a viable path. It won't be simple, he said. Whitfield will push on the boundary claim regardless. But if the timber lease is secured before the note comes due, the financial pressure loses most of its force. They can fight the boundary claim in court, and it may take years, but years is survivable. He closed his folio. This was good work. He was talking to the room, but he was looking at Clara. That evening, after Hargrove left, William found her in the kitchen. Mrs. Aldridge had long since retired. The house was quiet in the particular settled way of evening on a working ranch, when the day's noise has finally used itself up and what's left is just the basic sounds of the land doing what the land does without any help from anyone. William sat down at the table. Clara sat across from him. For a while, neither of them said anything, and the silence was full, in the way. Only silences between people who have been through something together can be full-textured, weighted, containing more than the absence of words. You saved it, William said. Hargrove saved it, she said. You'll save it. Clara. She stopped. He looked at her with the expression that she had been carefully, methodically, persistently not naming for weeks, because naming it would make it real, and real things could be lost. I'm not going to keep letting you do that, he said. Do what, she said. Take what you've done and make it smaller, he said. Make yourself smaller. I've watched you do it every time. Every single time something good happens because of you. There's this moment, just a second, where I can see you reaching for the version of it that diminishes your part. He leaned forward. I want to know why. She looked at him. Because people like me, she said slowly, learn very young that claiming credit is dangerous. That if you stand up and say I did that, someone is always ready to explain why you didn't. Or why it doesn't count. Or why the thing you did doesn't change what you fundamentally are. She paused. So you learn to do things, and then step back from them. You learn to let other people be the center of what went right. And what does that cost you, he said. She was quiet for a long time. Everything, she said finally, slowly, over years. It cost you the understanding that you did anything at all. He nodded. He reached across the table and placed his hand, palm up, between them. Not reaching for her, not pressing, just offering. The way he had offered everything since the beginning. Without condition, without the implication that she owed him anything for the offering. She looked at his hand. She looked at him. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with a gentle, unhesitating certainty that went through her, like the first warm day after a long winter, not dramatic, not explosive, but the deep and fundamental relief of cold finally ending. "I have something to tell you," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been trying," he said, "for approximately the last 6 weeks, to find the right time to say this. And I've decided there is no right time. There's just now." He held her hand with the same steadiness he held everything. "I love you. I love the way your mind works, and the way you fight for things without ever raising your voice, and the way you fix the chair when no one asked you to, and the way you make Mrs. Aldridge laugh. And the way you looked at me that first morning in town like you were trying to decide whether I was real." He paused. "I want you to stay, not as my housekeeper, not as the woman who works for me. I want you to stay as the person who makes this place mean something more than land and cattle." His voice was steady throughout. It did not waver. "I am asking you to marry me, Clara. If you'll have me." She had thought, in the abstract way you think about things you don't genuinely believe will happen, about what this moment might feel like if it ever came. She had imagined it would feel like rescue, like relief. Like the ending of something long and difficult, and the beginning of something easy. It did not feel like any of those things. It felt like standing at the edge of something enormous, and being asked, if you were to step forward into it, with your eyes open. It felt like the opposite of rescue. It felt like being asked, for the first time in her life, whether she wanted something. Not whether she could endure it, or survive it, or manage it with the resources she had available. Whether she wanted it, whether she, Clara Bennett, poor and parentless and invisible and useful and stubborn, and more than she had ever been allowed to know, whether she chose this. She found that her eyes had filled. She did not cry. But it was close. "I have spent my whole life," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, "being told that I was not the kind of person good things happened to." "I know," he said, "and I almost believed it," she said. "I almost believed it so completely that I would have left this ranch rather than let myself hope." "I know that too," he said. "If I say yes," she said, "I need you to understand something. I am not a project. I am not something to be rescued or fixed or improved. I am a person with opinions and flaws, and a temper when I'm pushed too far, and a habit of fixing things that aren't mine to fix." She looked at him with everything she had: no distance, no management, no protective shell. "I am not going to make myself small for you. I can't. I tried it for too long, and I don't know how to go back to it." "Good," he said. The word was immediate, complete. "I don't want a smaller version of you. I want this one. I want the one who walked into a room full of men with a property document and told them exactly what they were doing." He paused. "I want the one who stayed," she breathed. "Yes," she said. Just that, just the one word. But it was the truest word she had ever spoken. His hand tightened around hers. And Clara Bennett, who had spent 26 years being the woman nobody chose, who had carried herself through loss and poverty and humiliation and the long grinding work of surviving in a world that had decided she didn't quite deserve a place in it, said yes to the one person who had looked at her from the very first moment and seen not what she lacked but everything she was. The next morning arrived, with the particular cleanness of days that follow important things. Clara woke before dawn as she always did, but she lay in the dark for a few minutes before rising, which she almost never did, because she wanted to feel the difference. The before and after, the way the same ceiling, the same walls, the same cold morning air through the window gap could feel entirely different when you were a different person's looking at them. She was a different person. Not in the ways she had spent years wishing she could be different, not richer, not better, connected, not born into the family that would have given her the social standing this town measured people by. Different in the only way that actually mattered. She knew something now that she had not known before. She was worth choosing, not because William had chosen her, though that fact sat in her chest with a warmth she thought she would spend the rest of her life being surprised by, but because in the moment he had asked, she had not felt unworthy. She had felt afraid, and uncertain, and overwhelmed, and a dozen other things. But not unworthy, not the deep, settled, lifelong certainty of unworthiness that had been her most constant companion since the day she had buried her parents and understood that she was truly alone in this world. That was gone. She did not know exactly when it had gone. She suspected it had not left all at once, but had been wearing away, quietly and incrementally, with every morning at the ranch, every supper at the table, every conversation with William that treated her like a person worth talking to, every moment of being seen. She got up, she went to the kitchen, she started the stove. Mrs. Aldridge came in 20 minutes later, took one look at her face, and said nothing for a full minute while she made her own tea. Then she said, "Well, well," Clara agreed. "It's about time, Mrs. Aldridge said, and went back to her tea. The news reached Dust Hollow that same day, carried by some mechanism that Clara could not identify, but that she was no longer surprised by. By afternoon, it had taken on the particular shape of a story that a town was deciding how to hold, whether to frame it as scandal or romance, whether to place Clara in the role of schemer or Cinderella, whether William Carter's choice was a lapse of judgment or simply the act of a man who had always operated by different standards than the ones this town preferred. Margaret Holloway said nothing. For 3 full days, nothing. Which was, in its way, louder than anything she could have said. On the 4th day, Clara met her on Main Street, not by design. She had come to town for supplies, and Margaret had come out of the dressmaker's shop, and there was a moment where both women were simply there, on the same stretch of boardwalk, with nowhere to redirect. Clara did not slow down, she did not lower her eyes. She did not prepare the apology that had been her automatic response to this woman's presence for so many years that it had become almost reflexive. She met Margaret's gaze directly, and she said, "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," pleasantly, firmly, with the complete and genuine absence of deference. Margaret looked at her for a moment, with an expression that cycled through several things too quickly to name individually. Then she said, "Good morning, Miss Bennett," and she walked on. It was not a concession. It was not even exactly an acknowledgement of defeat. It was simply 2 women, on a street, exchanging a greeting. An ordinary moment, except that it was not ordinary at all. It was the first time, in as long as Clara could remember, that Margaret Holloway had spoken to her without the slight down pressure in her tone that reminded Clara where she stood. It was just words, neutral words, person to person. Clara walked on with her basket and her list, and her steady, unhurried steps, and she did not permit herself to make too much of it. But she noticed it, and she filed it away in the place where she kept the evidence that things could change. The timber lease was secured within the week, the contractor arriving at Carter Ranch on a Thursday with paperwork and a handshake, and the kind of straightforward transaction that did not require drama to be significant. Hargrove filed the response to Whitfield's boundary claim on Friday. The note was restructured at the bank on the following Monday. The banker, a man named Osgood, who had known William for 15 years, and had apparently been waiting for someone to give him a reason to push back on Whitfield's maneuvering, completing the transaction with something approaching satisfaction. Whitfield's consortium was not finished. Clara knew that. Hargrove knew that. William knew that. The boundary claim would go to court, and it would be slow, and it would cost money and attention, and there would be more pressure before it was over. That was the nature of people who operated at Whitfield's level. They did not stop. They simply changed tactics, and you had to be prepared for the next shape the problem would take before it took it. But the ranch was safe. For now, for this season, for this particular version of the threat. And something else had happened in the process of saving it that Clara was only beginning to fully understand. People had seen her, not in the passing way, not in the reluctant peripheral acknowledgement that she had been granted occasionally over the years when she made herself too useful to ignore. They had seen her in the room. They had watched her read a property document and identify a leverage point that a trained lawyer had missed. They had heard because news traveled about the timber rights and the contract and the solution she had assembled from pieces that had been sitting around for years, waiting for someone with the right kind of attention to put them together. Cord said to her one morning, with the gruff directness that was his only available register, "You know the boys in town are saying you're the one who kept the ranch." The boys in town, Clara said, should find something more interesting to talk about. Probably, Cord said, but they're not wrong. She looked at him. Don't let it go to your head, he said, and went back to his work with the expression of a man who has said all he intended to say and considers the matter closed. She smiled for a long time after he walked away. The weeks between the resolution of the immediate crisis and the arrival of winter were the fullest weeks of Clara's life, measured not by the things that happened in them. Though things happened, ordinary good things, the small daily things that are the actual substance of a life, but by the quality of her presence in them. She was fully there in a way she had never been fully anywhere before. Not managing her impact, not calculating the cost of being visible, not performing the particular careful smallness that had been her most reliable social tool for as long as she could remember. She planned the wedding with William in the practical, unromantic, slightly arguing way of two people who have strong opinions and are learning which of those opinions to hold firmly and which to yield on, which was both more difficult and more honest, and somehow more romantic than anything she could have planned in advance. She argued for small. He was inclined toward something the ranch's size could support. She said the neighbors, who had ignored her for 6 years, did not need the opportunity to attend her wedding, as though they had always been on her side. He acknowledged the logic of this, but pointed out that some of the people he wanted there happened to be neighbors, and she had to grant him that point. They settled on the church in Dust Hollow, small, with the people who actually mattered, which turned out to be fewer than the town, and more than just the ranch, and which included, to Clara's quiet astonishment, a handful of women she had not expected, women who came to her in the weeks before the ceremony, and said things, small and often clumsy things, that nevertheless contained the recognition that they had not handled Clara Bennett the way they should have, and that they knew it, and that if it was not too late they would like to do differently. She did not tell them it was fine. It was not entirely fine, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. But she told them she appreciated the saying of it. And she meant that. Mrs. Aldridge served as her witness and her attendant, and the closest thing she had to a mother in the room, and she wept with the unself-conscious openness of a woman who had earned the right to weep at a thing she had watched coming for months, and was very glad to see arrive. Cord and Pete sat in the front row and maintained expressions of studied stoicism that cracked, in both cases, at approximately the same moment, and did not entirely recover. And William. William stood at the front of the church with the slightly unfamiliar look of a man wearing his good suit on a day that mattered, and when she came down the aisle slowly, with Mrs. Aldridge's hand on her arm, with the particular feeling of a person walking voluntarily towards something they were still slightly afraid of but more afraid of, missing, he looked at her with the same expression he had worn since the first morning. The expression that said, "There you are." The expression that said, "I see you." The expression that said, "I have been waiting for you to believe that you deserve this, as long as you have been refusing to believe it, and I am glad we are finally here." She reached him. He took her hand. And the Reverend said the words that people had been saying over other people in this church for 20 years, the same words. And they meant something entirely different when you had been told your life that they would never be said for you. Afterward, walking out into the cold November morning, Clara Bennett, Clara Carter now, though she would spend weeks remembering to hear it, as her own name looked at the town that had spent years deciding she was nobody. And she felt something she could only call peace, not triumph, not vindication, peace. The specific peace of a person who has finally, after a very long time, arrived at the place they were always supposed to be and can stop looking over their shoulder for the thing that will take it away. William said beside her, "Are you all right?" She looked at him. She smiled, the real one, not the careful, managed smile she had deployed for years as social currency, but the full one, the one she had been discovering at Carter Ranch. Like finding a room in a house you thought you knew completely, and not knowing what to do with it at first, and then finding out that what you did with it was simply use it. "Yes," she said, and meant every word of it. Winter came to Carter Ranch the way it always came to Montana, without apology, without ceremony, without any particular interest in whether the people living under it were ready. Clara was ready. She did not know exactly when that had become true. At some point, in the weeks between the wedding and the first hard freeze, she had crossed some internal threshold she could not precisely locate and arrived at a version of herself that did not flinch when winter came. That did not spend the first cold morning cataloging all the ways things could go wrong. That woke up in a house that was hers genuinely, legally, irrevocably hers, and felt not the anxious disbelief of someone waiting for it to be taken back, but the steady, ordinary, unremarkable comfort of a person who has come home. It was unremarkable. That was the thing she had not expected. The life she had spent years believing was unavailable to her turned out, when it arrived, to feel less like a miracle than like something that had always been possible and had simply required the right conditions, the right person, the right season. She and William moved through the ranch's winter rhythms with the particular ease of two people who had been finding their way toward each other for months before they made it official, so that the marriage itself felt less like a beginning than like the formalization of something already well underway. They argued about ranch decisions, about money, about the pace at which Clara thought certain problems should be addressed, versus the pace William considered appropriately measured, and the arguments did not frighten her. They felt like proof of something, proof that she was real in this life, that she had standing, that her opinions had weight, and her disagreements had consequence, and she was not simply an adjunct to someone else's story, but a full, actual, irreplaceable presence in her own. Cord and Pete treated her with the quiet respect of men who had revised their understanding of something and did not intend to revise it back. Cord asked her opinion on the spring cattle rotation in January with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had decided months ago that she was worth asking and had simply been waiting for a natural moment to start. She gave her opinion. He considered it. He said, which from Cord was essentially an essay of agreement. Mrs. Aldridge retired in February. It was not a surprise. The old housekeeper had been talking about her sister in Oregon for the better part of a year, and the winter had made her knees worse than usual, and she said at their farewell supper, with the brisk practicality of a woman who did not believe in excessive sentiment, even when sentiment was entirely warranted, past the age of Montana to winters and very much ready for Oregon rain. Clara hugged her, which Mrs. Aldridge bore with the expression of someone who found affection slightly embarrassing, but was making an exception. "You are going to be fine," Mrs. Aldridge said, not gently, not as reassurance, as a statement of verified fact delivered by someone who had been watching the evidence accumulate for months and was now simply reporting her findings. "I know," Clara said, and the extraordinary thing was that she did know. Without the qualification, without the silent addendum of probably or maybe, or if nothing goes wrong. She knew it, the way you know things that have been tested enough times to have earned the status of truth. She was going to be fine. The Whitfield boundary claim went to court in March. Clara had expected to be anxious about it. She had been anxious about it in the weeks between the filing and the first hearing date, in the way you were anxious about things that threatened something you had only recently learned to hold. But something had shifted in her relationship with this particular anxiety in the month since the crisis. Since the moment she had walked into that meeting room with the property documents and named what Whitfield was doing in front of the men who were doing it. She was not helpless in this. She was not the woman who knelt in the dirt and said I'm sorry because she did not know what else to say. She was someone who read the filings and understood them and could walk into a courthouse and speak plainly about what they meant, and she intended to do exactly that. Hargrove came to the ranch the week before the hearing to go over the case. He arrived at the kitchen table, which had become the de facto conference room for Carter Ranch's legal and financial business, and he spread his papers out and went through them with the same competence he always brought. And Clara sat across from him and asked questions until she was satisfied she understood every piece of it. At one point, he stopped and looked at her with the expression that had been developing on his face since the first meeting, the expression of a man who kept having to update his assessment. "Has anyone ever told you," he said, "that you would have made an exceptional attorney?" Clara looked at him. "Several people have told me," she said, "that I should be grateful to have work at all." Hargrove held her gaze. "They were wrong," he said simply. She inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "they were." The hearing went 3 days. Clara sat in the courtroom for all of it, at William's side, and when the judge asked whether the property owner had anything to add to counsel's statement, William said, "My wife would like to speak," and the slight stir that went through the room was the kind of stir that Clara had stopped being bothered by and had started finding faintly satisfying. She stood up. She spoke for 11 minutes. She addressed the prior appropriation doctrine, the boundary survey discrepancy, and the specific chain of the document acquisition that she and Hargrove had traced to demonstrate that Whitfield's consortia, the neighboring filing, with full knowledge of the Carter Ranch claim, and had done so not in good faith, but as a deliberate instrument of pressure. She spoke without notes. She spoke without raising her voice. She spoke with the precision of someone who has read every relevant document and the confidence of someone who has stopped apologizing for knowing things. When she sat down, the courtroom was very quiet. Hargrove leaned over and said, under his breath, "I should be paying you." William said nothing, but he took her hand under the table and held it, and that was better than anything he could have said. The judge ruled in favor of Carter Ranch 6 days later. The boundary claim was dismissed. The prior appropriation doctrine applied. Whitfield's consortium had 30 days to remove any equipment from the contested parcel. Hargrove sent a letter with the news. At the bottom, in his careful legal hand, he had written, "Give my compliments to Mrs. Carter." The argument she made in court was the argument that won this. William read it aloud at supper. Cord said, which from Cord was a standing ovation. Clara said, "Pass the bread, please," because she had gotten much better at receiving good things gracefully, and she was not there yet on receiving credit for them, without deflecting. But she was working on it, and the not deflecting was getting closer. April brought mud and work and the particular renewal of a working ranch coming out of winter, when everything that has been held still by cold starts moving again at once. Clara moved with it. She was everywhere that spring, in the pastures, in the accounts, in the conversations with the hands, about what the operation needed for the season ahead. She was not trying to be useful. She simply was useful, in the automatic way of someone who has found the place where their capacities align with what is needed and has stopped managing the fit and simply lived inside it. And then something happened that she had not planned for. A woman came to the ranch, not Margaret Holloway, not anyone from the town's upper tier. A woman named Ruth Haynes, who lived in a rented room on the east side of Dust Hollow, and took in mending, and had been doing so for 11 years since her husband died, and left her with 2 children. and no savings and no family in the territory. She came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon and stood at the door with the careful, composed expression of someone who has rehearsed the dignity they intend to maintain, regardless of what happens next. Clara opened the door. Ruth looked at her. "Mrs. Carter," she said. "I'm sorry to come without notice. I heard," she stopped. Started again. "I heard that you used to, that things were different for you. Before," she paused. "I have a problem I don't know how to solve, and I don't know who else to ask." Clara stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." Ruth's problem was a landlord who was claiming she owed rent she had already paid and had no documentation to prove it, and a son who was being passed on over for work at 3 different operations in town, despite being capable and willing, and the general sense of a person who was running out of the resources, practical, emotional, interior, needed to keep going. Clara listened to all of it. She asked questions. Then she said, "The rent receipt, was it verbal or written?" "He said he'd send a written one," Ruth said. "He never did." "Does anyone else in the building pay the same landlord?" Ruth thought. "The widow on the 2nd floor, and the man in the corner room." "Would they speak to this?" Clara said. "Maybe. I don't know them well." "You don't need to know them well," Clara said. "You need them to confirm a pattern. If he does this to you, he does it to others. That's how these things work." She paused. "I know the magistrate's clerk. I'll write you a letter of introduction. You take your case there directly in writing with as much documentation as you can gather. Don't wait for him to do the right thing. Take the problem somewhere that has authority over him." Ruth stared at her. "You think that would work?" "I think," Clara said, "that people like him are counting on people like us to assume it won't." The word "us" sat between them for a moment. Ruth's eyes went slightly bright. She covered it quickly. Clara recognized the covering of it. She had done it herself for years, the reflexive suppression of emotion in front of anyone whose opinion of your composure might affect your circumstances. "Thank you," Ruth said. "Come back if it doesn't work," Clara said. "We'll find another way." Ruth came back 3 weeks later, not because the first approach had failed, but because she wanted to tell Clara it had worked. The magistrate's clerk had listened. The landlord had backed down. The documentation Ruth had gathered from 2 other tenants had been enough to establish the pattern Clara had suspected. She also brought her son. He was 18, with the particular combination of capability and wariness that came from having grown up watching things. His mother worked very hard for things that were always slightly insufficient. He shook Clara's hand and said he'd heard she was looking for a ranch hand for the spring. She had not been looking, but she looked at this young man with his mother's careful eyes and his own set jaw, and she said, "Can you work?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Can you learn?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you take direction from a woman without making it a problem?" He blinked, then said, "My mother's been directing me my whole life. I don't see why that would be a problem." Clara looked at him for a moment longer. "You start Monday," she said. His name was Thomas, and he was, as it turned out, exactly what he had presented himself as: capable, willing to learn, and possessed of a quality that Clara could only describe as genuine. He reminded her, in certain moments, of herself at that age, the hunger to prove something, the discipline born of necessity, the slight wariness of generosity, because generosity in her experience had so often come with conditions attached. She worked alongside him without making a project of it. She was simply herself, and she let him see what that looked like, and trusted that he would draw his own conclusions. This seemed to her the most useful thing she could offer, not instruction, not charity, but the evidence of her own life, conducted visibly, in front of him. It was, she realized, what William had done for her. That understanding arrived one evening in May, when she was sitting with William on the porch after a long day, and the ranch was settling into its evening sounds, and she was thinking about Thomas and Ruth, and the way the morning had gone. And William said, "You look like a person solving a problem." "I'm thinking about Thomas," she said. And I'm thinking that the most important thing you did for me," she said slowly, "was not the job." or standing up in Main Street, or any of the specific things. She paused. It was that you conducted your life in front of me, in a way that showed me what it looked like when someone knew their own worth. And I watched it long enough that it started to seem possible. That I could know mine. William was quiet for a moment. That's what you're doing for him, he said. I'm trying, she said. It's working, he said. I've watched him watch you. He's figuring something out. She looked at the land. 6 months ago, she had stood on this property as someone who was still deciding whether she had the right to be here. Now she was here, the way the land itself was here, not tentatively, not as a guest, not as someone who had been allowed temporary access to a place that belonged to someone else. She was here as someone it belonged to, as someone who belonged to it. The distinction was everything. The summer brought a development that neither of them had discussed explicitly, but that had been present in the unspoken architecture of the life they were building. Clara found she was expecting a child. She told William on a Tuesday morning, simply and directly, because she had learned that this was how she preferred to say important things, not with preamble, not with the elaborate management of someone else's potential reaction, but plainly, trusting that the person she was talking to could handle plain truth. He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do before, not once in all the months she had known him. He put his face in his hands, not from distress, she understood that immediately. From the particular overwhelm of a man who has spent years living with the quiet absence something he had stopped letting himself want, and who is now confronted with its presence so suddenly that the ordinary defenses have no time to arrange themselves. She put her hand on his shoulder. He reached up and covered her hand with his. They stayed like that for a minute, without speaking, in the kitchen of their ranch, in the May morning, with the whole future sitting between them like something that had finally agreed to be real. Are you all right? She said. He lifted his head. His eyes were red at the edges. Yes, he said, and then, with the particular rueful quality of a man who has just said something he knows to be insufficient, more than all right. Good, she said, because I'm going to need you to be functional. There are accounts to go over. He laughed. The real laugh, the one she had been hearing more often since November, the one that was becoming one of her favorite sounds in the world. Summer deepened. The legal victory over Whitfield solidified into permanence as his consortium turned its attention to other properties in other territories, and the threat against Carter Ranch became, gradually, historical. The boundary claim was formally dismissed in July. Hargrove came out to the ranch with papers and a handshake, and the expression of a man who found genuine satisfaction in outcomes like this one. And something else was happening, more quietly, in the margins of all of it. Clara was becoming known in Dust Hollow in a way she had never been known before. Not famous, not celebrated in the formal way of people who have done things the town could point to on a plaque, but known the way you became known, when you were a person who did real things in the world, and the world was not quite large enough to pretend not to see it. Ruth Haynes told people. Not strategically, she was not a strategic woman, but naturally, the way you told people about someone who had helped you, because gratitude had a way of wanting to be spoken aloud. And the people she told others, and the story that circulated was not the story of William Carter's poor wife, who had once picked bread off the ground, but the story of the woman who had saved the ranch and won the court case, and brought Ruth's landlord to account, and was, people said, someone you could go to when you had a problem you did not know how to solve. Women came, not all at once, but steadily, over the course of the summer and into the fall, women who had problems of the particular kind that poor women in 1884 Montana had, which was to say the kind that the formal structures of the world were not designed to address, because the formal structures of the world had not been designed with them in mind. Women who needed someone to read a document they did not have the education to read. Women who needed someone to tell them that the situation they were in was not normal and was not their fault. Women who simply needed someone to listen to them the way Clara had once desperately needed to be listened to, and had not been, for most of her life. She helped them, not because she had transformed herself into someone capable of saving everyone, not from any illusion that she could fix what was broken in the world that had treated her, and women like her, as though they were the world's least important people, but because she could read, and she could think, and she could speak plainly to people in authority, and she had learned from living it that sometimes all a person needed was one other person who looked at them and said, "You are not wrong, and you are not nothing, and here is what we are going to do." One afternoon in September, Thomas found her in the study, going over a letter from a woman in the next county, who had heard about Clara through Ruth and had written asking for advice about a property dispute. He stood in the doorway and looked at the letters on the desk and then at her. "How many of those are there?" he said. "More than last month," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother says you're the reason she didn't give up," he said. He said it with the directness of youth, without the self-consciousness that age sometimes brought to expressions of this kind. She says before she came here, she had stopped believing it was worth trying. Clara set down the letter. "Your mother," she said, "would have found her way regardless." "Maybe," Thomas said, "but she found it faster because of you." He paused. "I think that counts." She looked at him. He had grown 3 inches since spring, she thought. Or perhaps it was just the way he was standing straighter, with less of the braced wariness she had noticed in April. He looked like someone who had started to believe he was allowed to take up space. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to work. The evening of the day she received the letter about the boundary claim's final dismissal, William took her out to the hill behind the north pasture, the one that overlooked the full sweep of the ranch, the land they had fought for, the operation she had helped to save, the place that had remade her. He stood beside her. "I want to show you something," he said. "You're going to tell me something," she said. She knew him too well by now. He almost smiled. "I've been talking to Hargrove," he said. "About the ranch's structure, about the ownership." He looked at her. "I want to put your name on the deed, not as my wife's courtesy interest. As a co-owner, half." She looked at him. "The ranch is yours," she said. "The ranch is ours," he said. "You saved it. You kept it. Without you, it would be Whitfield's grazing land right now. Your name should be on what you helped to build." She was quiet for a moment. Not from hesitation, from the size of it. From the particular feeling of being seen completely, not just personally, not just emotionally, but practically, legally, in the hard and concrete way of the world, and finding that she had no argument against it. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, with a slight lift of something that might have been surprise. "Did you expect me to argue?" she said. "Honestly," he said a little. "I'm learning," she said, "to let good things be what they are." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that she had stopped trying to name and had simply allowed to be. What it was, the full, direct, uncomplicated expression of a man who loved the specific person standing next to him. Not the idea of her, not the role she played, but her Clara, with all of her history, and all of her stubbornness, and all of the ways she was still learning to believe she deserved what she had. She looked at the land. She thought about the morning on Main Street, the bread in the dirt, the crowd that did not move, the years and years of being told that she was the kind of person things happened to, rather than the kind of person who made things happen. She thought about the room above the feed store, and the narrow bed, and the basket she had carried through town, and the way she had made herself small for so long, that smallness had started to feel like her actual shape. She thought about the first morning she had woken up in this house, and looked at the ceiling and felt the difference. The before and the after, the terrible, ordinary, astonishing fact of a life that was actually hers. She placed her hand over the front of her coat, where the new life she was carrying had recently begun to make itself known in the small, undeniable ways of something real taking shape. She thought about who that child would grow up knowing. what stories they would have access to, what example would be standing in the kitchen every morning. When they came down for breakfast, going over accounts, writing letters, solving problems, taking up full and unapologetic space in a world that had tried very hard for a long time to convince her she had no right to any space at all. She thought about what she would tell them. Not the version with the rescued woman, and the heroic man, and the transformation that happens all at once, like a door opening. The real version. The version where the transformation was slow and hard and happened mostly in private. One small refusal at a time, the refusal to lower her eyes, the refusal to leave, the refusal to agree with the world's verdict about who she was and what she was worth. The version where the most important moment was not the wedding or the courtroom or the letter from Hargrove or any of the single events that a story could point to. The most important moment was the one she could not precisely locate, the moment she had stopped, somewhere in the middle of an ordinary day, believing the worst about herself. The moment the voice, that had spent 26 years cataloging her inadequacies, had grown quiet, and the quiet had lasted long enough for something else to be heard. The moment she had started, slowly and imperfectly, and against every old habit of mind, to see herself the way William had seen her from the very beginning. Not the woman without family or money or standing. Not the woman the town had written off. Not the woman who knelt in the dirt and apologized for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Herself, Clara, the woman who fixed things, who read documents, who asked questions worth asking, who loved with the particular intensity of someone who had spent years without it and knew down to the marrow what it cost to go without. Who had looked at a life being offered to her with open hands and had been afraid, and had chosen it anyway, and had kept choosing it every single day in the full and stubborn and irreversible understanding that she deserved it. William took her hand. She held on. "Do you know what I think?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think the story people will tell about this," she said, "is that you saved me. That you found me in the dirt, and you saw something worth saving, and you saved it." "And," he said, "and that's not the story," she said. "The story is that you looked at me long enough, and steadily enough, and honestly enough, that I learned to look at myself the same way." She paused. "You didn't save me, William. You just refused to look away. And that turned out to be the thing." He was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is the best thing anyone has ever said to me." She laughed, and the laugh went out across the ranch, across the land that was hers, the life that was hers, the future that was hers, clear and full and unmanaged, and completely, finally, unreservedly her own. Clara Carter had come a long way from the woman who knelt in the dirt of Main Street and believed, in the deepest and most unexamined part of herself, that she was nobody. She had not been saved, she had been seen, and in the end, that was the only thing that had ever needed to happen, because the woman who had always been worth seeing had been there all along, waiting, with more patience and more strength than she had ever been given credit for someone to simply refuse to look away. She had been worth it from the very beginning. She had just needed long enough to believe it herself.